Big Shaq follows the black woman who begged for food. But what waits beyond the crumbling gate isn't hunger, it's history. A silent son clutches secrets too heavy for his age. A house the city tried to erase still breathes beneath the rubble. And when the truth finally rises, Big Shaq's tears won't be from pity. They'll be from the weight of a fire his own blood helped ignite. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Los Angeles sun had just started to tip toward that soft, forgiving gold, the kind that made the sidewalks shimmer like old movie reels. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of a sleek black SUV, his driver still talking into an earpiece, the luxury of the moment humming beneath his sneakers. He had just wrapped a charity event downtown. Smiles, checks, photo ops, the kind of afternoon that looked good on Instagram and made headlines feel like hope. But as Shaq made his way toward the Whole Foods on Fairfax, it wasn't the cameras or the crowd that pulled his focus. It was the sound of something softer, smaller, almost like a prayer being swallowed by traffic. She was standing near the store's sliding doors, right where the polished sidewalk met the cracked one. A black woman, barefoot on concrete, her skin the color of worn chestnut, and her hair matted like memory. She wasn't loud. She wasn't holding a sign. She wasn't even looking at anyone. She whispered, almost sang under her breath. Just bread. Not money. Bread. People passed her like she wasn't real. Eyes forward. Earbuds in. Lattes gripped like lifeline. Shaq froze. There was no stench of alcohol. No ranting. No wild gestures. Just her whisper in the way she clutched an old canvas bag, close to her side. Her clothes were torn at the hems, and her shoulders stooped like they carried something heavier than years. He'd seen pain before, on courts, in locker rooms, even in shelters he'd funded, but this was different. There was nothing performative about her. She didn't even seem to expect kindness. What struck him wasn't desperation. It was hollowness. The kind of emptiness that suggested not just hunger but a hunger no one had cared to feed in a long, long time. He stood watching her longer than he realized. People began to recognize him. He offered a few nods, a practiced smile, but his eyes never left her, and then she moved. With a slight limp, she turned from the store's entrance and started walking east, away from the flow of foot traffic, away from any destination someone in her condition was supposed to want. Shaq felt something inside him flicker. He couldn't name it, but it burned quiet and low, like a wick catching flame. Without thinking much more, he slipped back into his SUV and told the driver to follow, but at a distance. Slow, just keep her in sight. The woman's pace was uneven. She took her time weaving through streets most people pretended didn't exist. Once or twice she looked back, as if checking for shadows. Shaq ducked. The SUV rolled to a quieter part of town, a place where manicured sidewalks gave way to cracked curbs and graffiti-covered fences. Eventually she turned sharply into a narrow alley that seemed swallowed by ivy and chain-link fencing. Shaq got out, alone. He followed quietly, footsteps muffled by dust and dried leaves. The alley was a tunnel of silence, broken only by the hum of distant traffic and the occasional flutter of pigeons. She didn't see him. She disappeared behind a broken wooden gate, into what looked like a forgotten pocket of the city, a place even GPS might skip over. He stopped at the gate. It hung crookedly from rusted hinges, and beyond it the house stood like a ghost. 2 stories, leaning like it had grown tired of standing. Windows were either boarded up or cracked. The yard was a tangle of weeds and memories. And there, slipping through the doorway, was the woman still clutching her bag, still whispering to someone he couldn't see. Shaq stood frozen. His mind raced. He was no stranger to poverty. But this was a different beast. This wasn't just a lack of resources. It was a place buried beneath the city's pulse, hidden under headlines and high rises. He didn't know what he'd expected, but it wasn't this. The sun began to dip, and a long shadow reached toward the house like a stretched hand. Shaq stepped back, slowly retreating down the alley. Something inside him told him not to knock. Not yet. Not today. This wasn't about showing up as a savior. This was about listening, seeing, understanding. Back in his SUV, the city looked different. The roads he'd driven 100 times now felt like pathways over forgotten graves. His driver asked where to next, and Shaq didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, his massive hands folded in his lap. Later that night, in his home that felt more like a museum than a memory, he sat at the kitchen island with a protein shake he didn't drink. His phone buzzed, interviews, charity follow-ups, a reminder to post about his upcoming docuseries. He put it all on silent. All he could see was her face. Not scared, not angry, just resigned. He didn't even know her name. But her silence had spoken more clearly than any interview he'd ever given. There was a story in that house. And it wasn't just about hunger. It was about being unseen, unheard, uncounted. Shaq remembered something his mother used to say. People don't always cry with tears. Sometimes they cry by going quiet. That night, he lay awake for hours, the ceiling fan spinning like time he couldn't catch. He thought about bread, about how the simplest request could feel like a scream when no one's listening. Tomorrow he'd go back, not just to give, but to learn, to follow the story behind those empty eyes. Shaq returned the next morning, dressed down in sweats and a hoodie, his face mostly hidden beneath a ball cap. The street still smelled of wet concrete and withered city life, the air heavy with early morning fog, and the echoes of a city trying to forget its dead ends. His driver waited 2 blocks away this time. Shaq didn't want anyone seeing where he was going. Not yet. He moved quickly, retracing yesterday's path, stepping past the overgrown ivy and rust-bitten fence that guarded the alley like an old watchdog. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, save for the occasional bark or the wheeze of a passing bus. As he approached the broken gate again, it hit him. This place was a void. There were no children playing, no sounds of music or laughter, no signs of delivery trucks or foot traffic, just silence, like time had forgotten this corner of the map. And then he saw it. The house, still standing like a relic of war, half sunken into itself, leaning in that peculiar way that made him feel like the whole structure might collapse if someone so much as exhaled too hard. It wasn't on Google Maps. He'd checked last night, scouring satellite views, until well after midnight. The street was visible, but the house was a smudge of tree cover and distortion, as if the pixels refused to acknowledge it. It made the place feel haunted, not with spirits but with stories buried too deep for technology to recognize. Shaq inched closer, staying behind the gate, his massive frame tucked awkwardly behind a leaning utility pole. Through the shattered slats of a wooden fence, he caught a glimpse of her. Delilah Grace. She was kneeling in the dead grass beside a small boy with skin like polished mahogany and hair tied in uneven twists. They were side by side, heads bowed, as if in prayer. The boy had his eyes closed tightly, his small hands clasped together. But Delilah's eyes were open, and she wasn't praying. She was talking soft, deliberate, and directed toward something or someone that wasn't there. Shaq leaned in, holding his breath to hear. Her voice was cracked from dryness, but unwavering. He woke up again last night, said he heard the train. But there ain't been no train in years. Mama, you remember when the rails ran through here? When Daddy used to sit on the porch and whistle to the conductor? Zion don't even know what a real train looks like. Can you believe that? Shaq swallowed hard. The boy Zion fidgeted, but didn't speak. He didn't look up. He just held tight to her side, like a lifeline. The yard was barren, save for a dented tricycle turned on its side, half buried in a patch of weeds. A crooked clothesline hung empty, swinging in the still air. There was no light in the house. The windows were cloudy, the roof sagging in places. A section of the siding had peeled away, revealing the bones of the structure beneath. It wasn't just neglected, it was surviving despite the world trying to erase it. Shaq backed away, careful not to let the chain-link fence rattle. He ducked into the alley, heart pounding harder than it should have. He wasn't scared, but he felt watched, not by them, but by something deeper, something stitched into the place. Back at the SUV, he opened the trunk and pulled out a few bags of groceries he'd picked up on the way: bread, applesauce, bottled water, a fleece blanket, and a box of cereal with a cartoon lion on the front. He carried the bags to the gate, set them down gently on the concrete just inside the property line, and turned away without knocking. He didn't want to thank you. He didn't want to be seen. Not yet. That night, back inside the mansion he called home, Shaq walked barefoot across polished marble, the cold echoing under his steps like whispers. The chandelier above the foyer glistened with light, and the fireplace crackled quietly behind him. But the warmth didn't reach him, not after what he saw. He sat in the study, dark wood, gold accents, walls lined with leather-bound books he hadn't touched in years. He tried reading, flipped on the TV, scrolled his phone. But none of it stuck. That house kept flashing in his mind. That woman's voice. The boy's silence. He thought about how many people he'd helped in his career. Kids, families, veterans. He built centers, paid medical bills, donated millions. But this wasn't charity. This was invisible America, the kind that sat behind no trespassing signs and refused to die. He wondered who Delilah had been before all this. A teacher, a nurse, someone's sister, someone's daughter, maybe all of it, maybe more. He wondered what Zion dreamed about in that crumbling house, if he dreamed at all, and why a boy that small could look like he'd already seen too much. Shaq got up, paced. He stared out at the backyard through floor-to-ceiling windows. He tried to imagine Delilah and Zion here, in his space, not out of pity, but out of a hunger for balance, for justice. His phone lit up on the counter. A text from Shawnee. "You good?" He stared at it for a long time before replying, "No, not really." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Shaq made up his mind. He didn't just want to give them food. He didn't just want to offer money or a shelter referral. He wanted to understand, to know how that house had ended up like that. How a woman like Delilah had become unseen. He wanted to know who had let it happen. Who had let them disappear. Because that house shouldn't exist. And yet it did. Forgotten by city planners. Dodged by developers. Hidden from view. It was like a scar on the city's face. Everyone chose to ignore. Shaq wasn't going to ignore it anymore. He wasn't sure what he'd find inside. He wasn't sure she'd let him in. But he knew this much. That house held more than poverty. It held history, hurt, maybe even hope, if someone was willing to look hard enough. And for the first time in years, Shaq felt something old and deep stirring inside him. A sense of responsibility that didn't come with headlines or hashtags. A fire. Tomorrow he'd go back. This time, not as a benefactor, but as a witness. The morning air was heavier than the one before, draped with a quiet tension that made even the birds seem reluctant to sing. Shaq arrived just after sunrise, parking his SUV farther away this time. Hidden between two delivery trucks near a shuttered laundromat. He walked the last few blocks on foot, hoodie up, steps deliberate. This wasn't about being seen. This wasn't about optics. It was about showing up, about showing her that he meant it. The house looked the same, like it was losing a slow war against time. Ivy now crept farther up the siding, and one of the front windows had been hastily covered with cardboard. The groceries he'd left the previous day were gone, though the empty brown bags were stacked neatly near the stoop, as if to say message received but not needed like that. Shaq stood at the gate, staring at the warped wood of the front door. He didn't knock right away. He gave himself a moment to just breathe, to feel the weight of what this place was. Then he raised his fist and knocked. Silence. A few seconds passed, and then the door cracked open. It wasn't Delilah. It was a boy. Small, maybe 6 or 7, eyes wide like they were always on alert, darting between Shaq's face and the horizon behind him, as if someone dangerous might be coming. The boy didn't speak. His mouth was shut so tight it almost seemed so. Shaq offered a slow, soft smile. He lowered his eyes briefly in greeting, trying not to make the boy feel cornered. That's when he noticed what the child was holding. A wooden cross, rough and chipped, clutched so tightly in his small hands it looked like it had splinters embedded in the skin. "Zion," Shaq whispered under his breath, remembering the name Delilah had muttered in the yard. The boy didn't nod, didn't confirm, but his eyes softened, just slightly, like maybe he'd heard it said gently for the first time in a long time. Shaq didn't step forward. He waited. Then from deeper inside the house, Delilah's voice rang out, not angry, not alarmed, but firm. "Zion, get back from the door." The boy stepped aside without a sound, disappearing into the dim hallway behind him. Delilah appeared a moment later. Her hair was tied back this time, wrapped in a faded green cloth. Her face looked more alert today, sharper around the edges, like sleep had either evaded her or burned something into her. When she saw Shaq, she didn't flinch, but her lips tightened. "You came back." Shaq nodded, hands in the front pocket of his hoodie. "Yeah." She leaned against the doorframe, not inviting him in, but not closing the door either. Behind her, the interior of the house was a collage of survival. Stacks of folded clothes, plastic jugs filled with water, a broken fan sitting useless in the corner, walls stained with smoke or history. It was hard to tell. "You don't belong here," Delilah said quietly, almost like a sigh. I know, Shaq replied. He kept his voice low. But I want to understand. I don't want to guess what your life is. Delilah's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened barely, like the first thaw of winter. He doesn't talk, she said suddenly, as if explaining away the boy before he could be questioned. Shaq glanced past her into the shadows of the hallway. Zion?
Delilah nodded. Hasn't said a word in 3 years. Since he watched them throw his uncle's body onto the hood of a cruiser like it was roadkill.
Shaq looked down at the porch beneath his feet. I'm sorry. Delilah shook her head. Don't be. Sorry doesn't change the fact they still sent us an eviction notice 3 weeks later. Said it wasn't racial. Said it was just policy. Her voice didn't rise. That's what chilled him. She wasn't angry. She was practiced. This was a script she'd recited too many times. I heard about the Spelman scholarship, Shaq said carefully. Delilah laughed. A dry, hollow chuckle. You Googled me? No, he said. I asked someone who remembers you. She crossed her arms. Well, yeah, I got in. Early admission, full ride. That was the year my brother Micah was shot 3 blocks from here for matching the description of someone who stole a bike. Never mind. He had a shift at the auto shop that afternoon. Never mind, he was 12. She turned, walked a few steps back into the house. After a second she called out, If you're coming in, wipe your shoes. Shaq stepped inside. The air smelled of dust, candle wax and something sweet. Maybe old cinnamon, the kind that clung to memories. The living room had no couch, just 2 milk crates with a blanket thrown over them, and a small folding table with an unplugged radio on top. In one corner an old photo album sat open, black and white images of faces that wore their joy like armor. Zion sat on a threadbare rug near the corner, cross still in hand, rocking slowly. Shaq knelt, keeping distance but lowering himself to the child's eye level. You like music, he asked, unsure if the boy would hear or care. Zion didn't respond, but his fingers tapped lightly against the cross. Delilah sank into one of the crates. He plays piano when he thinks I'm asleep. Only 2 keys. But they're always in time. Shaq's gaze moved across the room. There's a piano? In the basement, she said. Belonged to the church choir. They gave it to Micah before everything happened. Church? Shaq asked. Delilah didn't look at him. Mount Shepherd Baptist. Burned down 4 years ago. Arson. No suspects. Shaq nodded slowly. He could feel something pulling tight in his chest, like all the broken pieces of Delilah's story were starting to come together, but not into something whole. Into something heavier. I was thinking about your house, he said finally. How it's not even on the map. That's the point, she answered. If it's not on the map, they can't officially condemn it. They can't list it as unfit for human habitation and drag us out. You've been hiding. She looked at him sharply. We've been surviving. Shaq stood. The ceiling was low, forcing him to hunch slightly. The walls felt like they were pressing in, trying to remind him that he didn't belong. You don't have to prove anything to me, he said. Delilah leaned back. I'm not trying to, but I need you to understand. This isn't about handouts. I don't need another celebrity to do a press tour and throw a check at us. What I need, what Zion needs, is for someone to care enough to remember when we're gone. Shaq didn't respond right away. He watched Zion's fingers still tapping. Not random, not restless, rhythmic, purposeful, like a heartbeat in code. As he turned to leave, Delilah spoke again. You want to help? She asked. He turned back. Come tomorrow, she said. Bring nothing. Just listen. Shaq nodded once. I will. And as he stepped back into the light, the weight of the house followed him. Not like a burden, but like a calling. Shaq ducked low and descended, each step groaning under his weight. The light from above dimmed quickly, until all that remained was a thin silver beam slicing across the dust. He reached the bottom, and stood still. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The space smelled of old paper, scorched wood, and time left unattended. There were filing cabinets, overturned pews, and against the far wall, a rusted cot beneath a flickering battery-powered lamp. And sitting on the cot was a man, thin, tall, draped in a dusty overcoat, his hands clasped over a Bible so worn the edges had curled like dried leaves. You made it, the man said, his voice raspy but full of deliberate rhythm, like he was still practicing sermons no one came to hear. Shaq stepped closer, cautious. You Hollis Carr? The man lifted his head. His eyes were tired, yellowed at the edges, but still carried the strange defiance of a man who hadn't died yet, despite everything trying to kill him. What's left of him? Shaq had heard the name before. Hollis Core was once known across the state as the voice of Mount Shepherd Baptist, a firebrand preacher who stood with activists, fed the hungry, spoke with righteous heat, but he had vanished years ago after the church burned. There were rumors, mental breakdowns, secret debts, fleeing to Florida, but none ended within a basement under a crumbling house. I didn't come looking for you, Shaq said. Kerr gave a crooked smile. Nobody ever does. The silence between them was strange, not empty, more like an inhale before something important. Then Carr spoke again, this time softer. This house is the last place they couldn't buy. Shaq squinted. They? Kerr laughed. It sounded like something dry breaking in his chest. Developers. Bureaucrats. City men in suits and gold watches, who walk into churches pretending to be angels. They brought envelopes and contracts, talked about urban renewal and job creation, but it was always about control. They used God's name like currency. Shaq shifted, his back brushing against a shelf of hymnals now thick with mold. You were the pastor. Why hide? Kerr's face hardened. Because I was the one who let them in. The admission sat in the room like smoke. I thought I could negotiate, Kerr continued. I thought if I let them take the land behind the church just a few lots, they'd leave the sanctuary alone. But they kept coming back. More money, more pressure, more promises. And when Delilah's mama tried to organize resistance, they found a fire, and I found a hole to crawl into. Shaq leaned against a support beam, trying to process the weight of it. You're saying they burned it down? I'm saying they erased it, Kerr said. No charges, no arrests, no story, just code violations and redevelopment plans. Delilah's mother died the same month. Some say grief, some say poison. Shaq ran a hand over his face. So why stay here? Kerr looked around the room like it was a church still echoing with sermons. Because I owe it to them to remember. This house was the choir director's home. When they leveled everything else, they missed it. Delilah moved in. Zion was born. And I stayed beneath. Shaq exhaled, slowly. Why hasn't anyone told this story? Because it's not clean, Kerr said. Doesn't fit on a flyer. Doesn't sell. It's not about triumph. It's about what happens when justice doesn't arrive. Shaq paced now, every breath dragging heavier. He looked at the preacher, gaunt, folded into himself, clutching that ragged Bible like a piece of his soul still lived in it. They used the Bible to bleed us, Kerr whispered, eyes closed. Shaq stopped. That line sat with him like a weight pressing into his ribs. They told us to forgive while they paved over graves. Told us to be patient while they handed our inheritance to developers. Told us to be humble while they built condos over the ruins of our voices. Shaq stared at the basement walls. Old photos hung there. Children in Sunday clothes, smiling. Women cooking in church kitchens. Choir members mid-song. The frames were dusty, but their joy hadn't faded. You gonna stay down here forever? Shaq asked. Kerr chuckled again, dark and bitter. No, but I'm not ready to be seen yet. I still got shame on me. Still got names I can't speak without breaking. Shaq stepped toward the stairs, eyes lingering one last time on the preacher. Delilah knows you're here? Kerr nodded. She feeds me, brings books, doesn't judge me. Shaq gave a faint smile. She's good at that? Better than me, Kerr muttered. Better than all of us. As Shaq climbed the stairs back into the light, each step felt like it carried part of the basement with it. The air upstairs wasn't any fresher. It was just louder, brighter. Delilah sat at the table, shelling beans into an old bowl. She didn't ask what he saw. She didn't need to. He's still preaching, Shaq said quietly. She nodded. Just not out loud anymore. Shaq looked around again. The cracked walls, the fading photos, the silence that didn't beg to be filled. This place isn't just a shelter, he murmured. It's a tomb. Delilah's hands paused for a moment. Not a tomb, she said. A ledger. Shaq frowned.
What do you mean?
A record of what they took, she said. And what we refused to forget. And in that moment, Shaq knew the story wasn't just about a woman and her silent son. It was about a neighborhood buried alive. And a preacher beneath the floorboards, still whispering truths nobody wanted to hear. Shaq stood at the edge of Delilah's yard, his eyes trailing the rust-colored fence that divided her home from the dilapidated house next door. He hadn't noticed it before. Not really. Maybe because it looked like all the other forgotten places on this block. But this morning something was different. A slow, rhythmic thump echoed from behind the fence, like someone was tapping wood to a metronome. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, measured. A call, maybe, or a warning. Delilah had mentioned the woman next door once, briefly, said she didn't talk to many people anymore, said she remembered too much. Now curiosity and the weight of what Shaq had uncovered in the basement pulled him toward the creaking gate. He pushed it open gently and stepped into a yard half swallowed by vines, where time had layered over everything like thick dust. The air smelled of cedar, wilted flowers, and something faintly metallic. On the porch sat a figure, small, wrapped in a faded quilt, her white hair loose and blowing slightly in the breeze. She rocked in a chair that looked too fragile to hold her, and beside her rested a walking cane made of old, gnarled wood. "You finally came," she rasped before Shaq could say a word. Her voice was like paper against stone, rough and soft at the same time. Shaq stepped closer. "You know who I am?" "Everybody does," she said, her eyes staring straight ahead. "Doesn't mean I know who you are, though." He nodded slowly. "I'm just trying to understand what happened here." She tilted her head slightly, one pale blue eye twitching. "Then you came to the right, ghost." He lowered himself onto the top step, his knees cracking under his own weight. From this angle he could see her face more clearly, lined like a road map, her skin a patchwork of age spots, and the kind of sorrow that carves deep, permanent paths. "I'm Ruthie Lane," she said. "Lived here 63 years. Knew Delilah's mama, knew the cars, knew the whole block before it got swallowed." Shaq watched her hands. They trembled slightly, but moved with purpose, as she reached beneath her quilt and pulled out an old leather-bound journal. The edges were frayed, the cover soft from use. She held it out toward him. "Take it. I'm done carrying it." Shaq accepted it carefully, surprised by the weight of the thing. Not just physical, but emotional. He opened to a random page, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, photocopied legal forms, maps with red lines, names scratched out. Beneath the pages, a story unfolded, one of displacement, forged signatures, falsified property records, and entire black families relocated with the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that didn't leave bruises but broke bones, just the same. "They called it urban renewal," Ruthie said, her voice cracking with a bitterness that hadn't aged. "But they were building graves, not homes." Shaq flipped farther, pausing at a photo that caught his breath mid-chest. A black and white image, grainy, torn slightly at the edge, showing a protest outside City Hall. It wasn't the signs or the crowd that gripped him. It was the face near the front. A younger man, tall, broad, unmistakable. His father. Shaq stared at it like it might disappear if he blinked too hard. "I didn't know he was part of this," he murmured. Ruthie didn't turn her head. Her eyes, cloudy with near blindness, stayed fixed on the horizon. He marched once, then he disappeared when the real pressure came. Most did. Shaq's hands tightened around the journal. "What are you saying?" She shifted in her chair, her voice softening but gaining edge. "I'm saying that picture might be the only moment he stood on the right side. After that, ask yourself who paid for your house in '92. Ask yourself what deal was struck for your college trust." A wave of heat flushed Shaq's face. "My dad worked 3 jobs. "Your dad was approached by the same men who burned the church," Ruthie interrupted. "Only difference is he signed. Delilah's mama didn't." Silence settled like dust between them. Shaq looked down at the journal, flipping through more pages, trying to anchor himself with facts. But the more he read, the more the foundation under him cracked. Names he recognized, places he'd driven past 1,000 times, patterns of erasure too clean to be accidental. "I'm not my father," he finally said. Ruthie exhaled, slow and long. "Didn't say you were, but don't pretend you ain't standing on ground." He helped clear. Shaq wanted to argue, wanted to explain, to defend, but the truth was swelling too loudly in his ears. He'd always known there were things his family didn't talk about. Old business, his uncles would call it. Done deal. Now he saw what had been buried under that silence. A legacy of compromise built on the silence of the ones who couldn't afford to forget. He flipped to the last few pages of the journal. Taped inside was a birth certificate, Delilah's, and beneath it, a letter addressed to no one specific. Written by hand, in ink faded by time. "If you're reading this, it means the fire didn't kill us. But the forgetting might." Please don't forget. Shaq closed the journal and looked back at Ruthie. She hadn't moved. Why are you giving this to me? Because you got reach, she whispered. Because you got microphones and cameras and people who listen when you say things. And because maybe you still got a conscience left to burn. Shaq swallowed hard. You ever wonder why Delilah's never left? She asked. She could have gone, took Zion and disappeared. But she stayed. Because somebody's gotta remember. And you? Shaq asked. Why didn't you leave? Ruthie smiled, slow and sad. Because this porch is the last place where my husband's laugh still lives. Because my daughter's baby shoes are buried under that tree. Because when they came with their papers and threats, I told them I was blind, not stupid, and I dared them to drag me out. Shaq sat back against the railing. The weight of everything he had seen in the last few days pressed against his ribs like a truth he couldn't unlearn. What do I do with this? He asked, lifting the journal.
You carry it, Ruthie said, and you let it change the way you speak. You let it shape what you build next. Not for show, for soul.
Shaq stood, slowly, holding the journal like something sacred. He looked back toward Delilah's house, now no longer just a broken building, but a monument to resistance, a place where stories had been preserved, even as the world worked to erase them. As he stepped off Ruthie's porch, her voice called out one last time. You want redemption? She said. Start with truth. It's heavier than money, but it buys you something real. And as Shaq walked away, heart pounding, he knew she was right. The past hadn't just come knocking. It had unlocked the door and stepped into the light, demanding he do more than look. It was asking him to answer. The boy had crawled into the cabinet under the sink, curled into himself, arms wrapped tight around his knees, eyes wide open but unfocused, like he wasn't in the room at all. Shaq knelt beside the cabinet slowly, his large frame hunched down so he didn't seem towering or threatening. It's okay, he said softly. It's just me. No one's here but me. Zion didn't move, didn't blink. Shaq stayed with him, crouched low on the cold tile floor, the wind howling against the thin window panes behind them. He pulled the duffel bag closer and unzipped it, pulling out one of the thick fleece blankets. Without reaching too far, he held it out, let it dangle near the cabinet's edge. You want this? It's warm.
No answer.
He set it down slowly on the floor, just within reach. Time passed. Minutes, maybe. Long enough for the candle in the other room to die down to a nub. Shaq stayed there, knees stiffening, back aching. But he didn't move, didn't push. Then, just as he was about to lean back and give Zion more space, the boy's hand emerged. Slowly, carefully, tiny fingers touched the edge of the blanket and pulled it in. The cabinet door didn't close again. Zion just curled deeper inside, clutching the warmth, like it was all that held him to earth. Shaq whispered again, voice barely more than breath. You're safe here. I got you. Zion still didn't speak, but he blinked, and Shaq saw it, the tremble behind his eyes. Not fear, not quite, more like memory. An hour passed, then two. Shaq stayed on the floor. Eventually he leaned back against the fridge, arms folded, eyes closed. He didn't sleep, just listened, to the creaks, to the wind, to the soft, near-silent breathing coming from the cabinet. And then, barely louder than a whisper, Zion spoke. They hit my mama 'cause she said no. The words cracked the air like a glass breaking in an empty room. Shaq's eyes opened wide, his breath caught in his throat. Zion didn't repeat it, just stayed there, motionless. Shaq slid closer. When was this? The boy looked straight ahead, not at Shaq, not at anything in the room. They came last summer, told her to sign. Mama said she wasn't leaving. Man in a suit said she didn't have a choice. Shaq listened, heart thudding. What did they do? Zion's voice dropped to something even smaller. He grabbed her arm, said he'd make her. The tall one, with the glasses. Mama shoved him. Then two others came. Said the cops wouldn't care. One of them kicked the door so hard it cracked. Shaq's jaw clenched. He kept his voice even. Did anyone see it happen? Zion nodded slowly. Miss Ruthie. She yelled at them from her porch. Shaq exhaled. That explained Ruthie's sudden anger. She'd seen more than she let on. The boy shifted, uncurled slightly. Mama told me to hide under the bed. She said they don't see us if we don't make noise. Shaq's stomach turned. A 7-year-old boy trained to disappear. They haven't come back? He asked. Zion shook his head. Not yet, but Mama said if they show up again, we run. Shaq sat still for a long moment, every thought churning through his mind like gears grinding metal. He thought about the papers Ruthie had shown him, the journal, the names, the missing church, the systemic eviction lists, the forged documents, and now this. The syndicate hadn't just been using pressure. They'd been using fear. Do you know the name of the man in the suit? Shaq asked carefully. Zion squinted. Harper. Harper something. Mama spit when she said it. Shaq knew that name. Harper Voss. Developer. Power broker. Donor to city council campaigns. Owner of a real estate conglomerate that had spent the last 5 years reclaiming neighborhoods across LA. Pushing out legacy black residents with under-the-table threats, cash bribes or forged legal work. Shaq had shaken Harper's hand once. At a gala. He'd thought the man was polished, ambitious. He hadn't known. Now he did. Shaq finally stood, legs stiff, knees cracking like firewood. He pulled his phone out and typed the name Harper Voss and scrolled through the search results. Smiling faces, ribbon cuttings, revitalization projects. But behind those eyes now, Shaq could see it calculated violence without a fist. Oppression in a suit and tie. Delilah appeared behind him then, quietly. Her face was pale, her voice calm but strained. He told me he could bury us, she said. Said the paperwork didn't matter. Said the city would make it happen either way. Shaq turned to her. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Delilah stepped into the light. There was a bruise faintly visible on her wrist. Old but stubborn. Because people like him have power, and people like me, we get buried beneath concrete, and called blight. Shaq looked from her to Zion, who had now stepped out of the cabinet. Still small, still silent, but taller somehow, standing in the warmth of the kitchen's thin light. I'm not gonna let this go, Shaq said. I promise you that. Delilah nodded, but her face was cautious. Promises are easy. Standing up to men with property lawyers and private security, that's something else. I know, Shaq said, but this isn't just about property anymore. Delilah raised a brow. Then what is it? Shaq glanced down at Zion, who was now gripping the hem of his mother's coat. It's about survival, Shaq said, and what they're willing to destroy to keep their empire growing. That night Shaq drove home with Zion's voice looping in his head like a song too sad to forget. They hit my mama 'cause she said no. And just like that, the story stopped being about poverty.
It had become a war.
A quiet one, but no less brutal. Shaq stood in the doorway of his mother's house longer than he needed to. The porch light was already on, casting a low amber hue across the faded doormat that still said bless this home, even though the bee had rubbed off years ago. He hadn't called ahead. He rarely did anymore. But Lucille O'Neill always left the door unlocked, like she knew he'd show up when his heart got too heavy to carry alone. He stepped inside and was met with the familiar scent of nutmeg, wood polish, and the faint sweetness of lemon tea. The old gospel vinyl playing low in the corner told him she'd been thinking. That's how she worked. No TV, no news, just music and silence. Until something inside her said the world was shifting again. She was in her chair, of course, rocking slow. A blanket across her lap, one slipper barely hanging on. Her eyes still sharp despite time and truth, flicked up when he entered. I wondered how long it'd take. Shaq sank into the couch across from her, resting his elbows on his knees, his frame too large for the delicate furniture of his childhood. He didn't speak for a while. Lucille didn't rush him. I found out something, he said eventually, his voice low. Lucille tilted her head, listening. She didn't nod or prompt him, just waited. He told her everything. About Delilah. Zion. The house. The preacher in the basement. The journal. Ruthie. Harper Voss. The threats. The silence. The fire. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The weight of his words filled every corner of the room like slow-moving smoke. When he finished, Lucille didn't speak right away. She reached over to the side table and opened a drawer that had always seemed decorative but was apparently functional all along. From it she pulled a folded piece of paper, aged and yellowed at the edges, held together more by memory than paper fiber. She handed it to Shaq. He unfolded it carefully, the corners crumbling slightly under his fingers. It was a letter, handwritten in delicate, looping script, dated July. Dear Charles, you promised when the city men came that you'd stand with us, that the land would remain ours. that what we built with calloused hands and hymns wouldn't be sold to the highest bidder. But now they tell me you've changed your mind. That the check was too big. That the silence was too easy. You were supposed to be our shield. If you sign, the church goes, and with it everything we held together. I pray you reconsider. For Zion. For Ruthie. For the memory of what we survived.
Naomi Grace.
Shaq read it twice. To Lila's mother, he said finally, though he already knew. Lucille nodded slowly. Naomi and I used to braid each other's hair on the stoop. Your daddy and her marched side by side before the money started to speak louder than the sermons. When the developers came, they offered your father more than a handshake, and when he signed, the whole street started to unravel. Shaq's grip on the letter tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Lucille looked him dead in the eyes. Because for a long time I thought silence was survival, and because I knew one day you'd come face to face with the truth, and I needed you to be strong enough to hold it. He stood, walked to the window, looking out at the backyard that once held cookouts, birthday parties, family secrets. The moonlight hit the glass just right, and for a moment he saw his own reflection staring back, wearing a weight he hadn't asked for but now couldn't ignore. I need to do something, he said. Lucille didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for her tea, sipped it slowly, then set it down with a soft clink. You're walking into a fire you didn't start, she said gently. Just don't let it burn you trying to put it out. Shaq turned. So I'm supposed to do nothing? Lucille shook her head. I didn't say that. But don't mistake action for purpose. If you do this just to look like a hero, you'll end up another name on a street sign that don't lead nowhere. But if you do it because it's right, because it's what the silence is demanding, then maybe, just maybe, something good will finally grow from all this ash. Shaq sank back onto the couch. The letter still trembled slightly in his hands. You think people will care? About a letter from 1986? About a woman who's been gone for years? About a boy who won't speak? And a pastor hiding underground? Lucille leaned forward, her eyes fierce and unwavering. You care, and that's where it starts. He nodded slowly, the decision stitching itself together inside him like a quilt of memories and duty. He would go public, not with a donation, not with a PR campaign, with the truth, the letter, the journal, the names, the story no one wanted to hear. He would call a journalist he trusted. He would sit in front of a camera. He would speak their names, not his. The clock on the mantel ticked on, steady and soft. Then his phone buzzed. Delilah's name flashed on the screen. He answered instantly. But it wasn't her voice. It was Zion. And he was crying. She's gone, the boy whispered. Mama's gone. Shaq sat upright. What do you mean gone? Zion sniffled. She told me to hide under the bed. I heard yelling, then nothing. When I came out, she was gone. Shaq's heart dropped. Zion, are you alone right now? Are you safe? I'm in Miss Ruthie's house, he said between breaths. She told me to stay here. Said she's calling someone. Shaq was already grabbing his coat. Listen to me. I'm coming right now. Don't move, okay? Stay with Miss Ruthie. Don't open the door for anyone but me. Zion didn't answer, but the line stayed open. Shaq turned to Lucille. She's gone. Someone took her. Lucille's face darkened, jaw tightening with something between fear and fury. Then it's already started. Shaq stared at her. What started? She stood slowly, walked to the drawer, and pulled out another item, a faded photograph of Harper Voss standing next to a young city councilman. And shockingly, Shaq's father. They've been working the system for decades, Lucille said. Harper learned from your daddy's generation, bought out neighborhoods with silence and threats. And if threats didn't work, people disappeared. Shaq held the photo up, seeing the false smiles now for what they were. I need to find her, he said. I don't care what it costs. Lucille nodded, placing a hand on his arm. Then be ready to lose something. He turned toward the door, heart pounding with fear and rage, and something deeper, clarity. The fire had already started, and Delilah was inside it. They think we don't have a choice. Before he could respond, tires crunched against gravel outside. Shaq turned through the shattered window. Headlights beamed into the sanctuary like searchlights. A sleek black car pulled up, followed by another. 4 men stepped out, 2 in tailored suits, 2 with dark jackets and earpieces. And then came Harper Voss. He stepped through the ruined doorway, like a man walking into his own living room. His gray suit was immaculate. His smile practiced, eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses that caught the dying light. He looked at Shaq and Delilah, like he was greeting actors in a play he'd already written. "Well," he said smoothly, "you made it." Shaq didn't move. Delilah's breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. Voss walked slowly, boots clean even on ash, as if the ruin of a church couldn't stain him. "This place brings back memories, doesn't it?" he mused. "All those sermons, all that hope." He looked around. Shame it had to end like this. Shaq stepped forward. "Cut the performance." Voss smirked. "Straight to the point. That's what I like about you, Shaquille. No pretense. No games. That's why I'm offering you something real." He gestured toward the men behind him. One stepped forward, holding a briefcase. "You walk away," Voss said. "You let this whole situation fade into the past. And no one has to get hurt. No public fallout. No stories. And the boy, he goes home, safe and sound." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't?" Voss's smile didn't falter. "Then the city finds out what your daddy did in '84. The signatures. The side money. The quiet hand he played in giving me a foothold in South Lay. It's all still buried. But not gone. And when it comes up, guess whose name headlines it now?" Shaq's stomach churned. He'd suspected the weight of his father's choices, but hearing it from the devil's own mouth twisted the truth into something razor-sharp. Delilah stepped closer, her voice cold. "You use children to negotiate." Voss didn't even blink. "I use leverage. This is business." Shaq shook his head, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small black device no bigger than a pen. "I've been recording since the minute I stepped in," he said. Voss raised an eyebrow. "So?" Shaq smiled for the first time. "So you just admitted to coercion, kidnapping, and blackmail on federal property. And I've got more. Ruthie's journal, Pastor Carr's testimony, Zion's story. It's all documented. All of it is going live. Tonight." Voss's smile faltered for the first time. "You wouldn't dare." Shaq took a slow step forward. "Try me." From outside, sirens split the air, piercing, rising, growing closer. Not just one. A fleet. Voss turned, eyes narrowing. "You called them?" Shaq's voice was a low thunder. "No. I called the press. And they brought the rest." The sanctuary filled with red and blue light. As cruisers pulled into the lot, men with badges poured out, followed by 2 reporters with cameras already rolling. Shaq turned to Delilah, nodded once. Her hand gripped his. Voss backed toward the doorway, his confidence unraveling. "You think this ends with me? I'm not the only one with roots in this city." Shaq didn't respond. He didn't have to. The truth was speaking now. Officers entered, asking questions. Lawyers followed. The private security men tried to slip away, but they were stopped. Voss was ushered out, hands not in cuffs but with reporters filming every word he tried to spin. Shaq stood still in the center of the burned church, Delilah beside him. The moment was raw, victorious but not clean. The boy was still missing. The home was still broken. The city still sick. But for the first time in a long time, silence didn't win. Delilah looked up at Shaq, tears finally pooling at the corners of her eyes. "Do you think they'll bring him back?" Shaq placed a hand on her shoulder. "They'll have to." He looked around the church again at the burnt pews, the crumbling walls, the graffiti left by someone who refused to forget. "This is where it started," he said softly, "and now it's where it turns." Outside the cameras rolled. But for once they weren't pointed at a tragedy. They were pointed at a reckoning. The storm didn't come with lightning. It came with light. Camera flashes. Microphones. Satellite trucks lining the curb outside City Hall like they were filming a movie. But this time, the script wasn't fiction. The story of Delilah Grace, her son Zion, and a once-forgotten block of South LA had reached the ears of the nation. And now the world was watching. Shaq stood at the podium, dressed not in a suit but a simple black hoodie, with a faded image of Mount Shepherd Baptist printed on the chest. His voice had never trembled on the court, never buckled under pressure. But this wasn't a game. This was truth, raw, uncomfortable, and overdue. Behind him, Delilah stood tall, Zion clutching her hand, Ruthie seated in her wheelchair beside Pastor Hollis Carr, whose sunken eyes had found a new kind of fire. Josiah Ray, the formerly houseless activist turned neighborhood archivist, stood next to them, holding the thick journal that had cracked the silence wide open. A street choir hummed softly under their breath in the distance, an impromptu gospel loop repeating, "Don't let us be forgot." Shaq took a breath and began. "You all know me as Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq. Basketball player. Businessman. Broadcaster. You've watched me win. You've watched me fall. You've watched me build. He paused. But what you haven't seen is the story behind a woman most of y'all walked past. Her name is Delilah Grace. She didn't ask me for money. She didn't ask me to fix her life. She asked for bread. Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled. But the crowd, both physical and virtual, fell quiet. She was never just hungry for food. She was hungry to be seen, to be heard, to be treated like a human being in a city that decided she was an obstacle to profit. Shaq gestured to Zion, who now stood slightly apart from his mother, his hand still holding tight to the wooden cross he used to hide behind. This boy didn't speak for years, Shaq continued. Not because he couldn't, but because every time his world tried to speak, it got shut down, beaten, evicted, ignored, until one night, he whispered 7 words that shattered me. They hit my mama 'cause she said no. A gasp rippled through the press area. This story isn't new, Shaq said. It's just been buried under paperwork and cement, under condos and tax breaks, in a city that sold out its soul. But it's time to dig it up. He stepped aside. Delilah moved toward the mic, face calm, voice steady. I was offered a new home. A check. A deal, she said. But I said no, not unless it's for all of us. Because this isn't about me and Zion. This is about Ruthie, who watched her neighbors disappear. About Hollis Carr, who buried his guilt in a basement. About Josiah Ray, who slept on the streets built over his father's legacy. This is about every person told their roots don't matter, because someone else saw profit in their pain. Reporters raised hands. Cameras zoomed in. The choir's hum faded into silence. Zion stepped forward. Shaq knelt beside him, whispered, "Only if you want to." Zion nodded. He took the mic with both hands, his small fingers shaking but firm. His voice, when it came, was soft, but powerful. My mama told me we ain't poor. We're just buried alive. And if someone would just dig us up, they'd see we're still growing. That was it. One line. And it broke something open. The crowd stood, applauded, cried, not because of performance, because of truth. In the days that followed, the broadcast reached every corner of the country. News outlets replayed the clip of Zion's words. Influencers posted reaction videos. Lawmakers issued statements of solidarity. But more importantly, things began to move. The city launched a full investigation into Harper Voss and the real estate syndicate. Arrests followed, not just his, but 3 members of the zoning commission, a deputy mayor and a developer tied to 10 forced evictions. Delilah's house, once marked for demolition, was named a historical preservation site, but she didn't keep it for herself. She handed the deed over to a new community trust, led by Ruthie and Josiah, dedicated to protecting homes from silent displacement. Pastor Carr began preaching again, outside on the steps of the scorched church, where people gathered without pews or air conditioning, but with something stronger, presence. Shaq used his money, not to rebuild luxury, but to fund a neighborhood archive, a legal defense fund, and a new school named after Naomi Grace, Delilah's mother, who once wrote a letter that helped unravel a city's lie. But none of it felt like an ending. Shaq knew that. Change wasn't a ribbon cutting. It wasn't a press conference. It was slow and hard and rooted in people like Delilah who refused to vanish, in boys like Zion, who dared to speak. At a private ceremony days later, Ruthie asked Shaq a question. You ever figure out what side your daddy was really on? Shaq looked at the crowd around them. The music, the food, the photographs of ancestors taped to folding chairs, so they too could bear witness. I think he was lost, Shaq said, but I'm not. Ruthie smiled, eyes wet. That's all we needed. The story had begun with bread, a request so small it could have been ignored. But it hadn't been. It had led to Zion, finding his voice, to a city forced to listen, to a movement born not in anger, but in memory. And on that last day, as Shaq stood beside Delilah and watched Zion place a stone marked with his mother's initials on the rebuilt church steps, he whispered only 4 words to himself. This is the beginning. The air smelled different now, not like fire or dust, or the dull ache of something dying slowly. It smelled like freshly turned soil, hot pavement after rain, and cornbread cooling on a kitchen windowsill. The streets of South LA hadn't changed overnight. There were still cracked sidewalks, still sirens in the distance, still boarded up shops in places. But something deeper had shifted, like the neighborhood had drawn a new breath, and realized it was still alive. Shaq walked down the block, unbothered by the sun overhead, or the cameras that now followed him only part-time. This wasn't about him anymore. Had never really been. He passed the lot where Mount Shepherd Baptist had once stood. In its place now stood a framed skeleton of steel beams and lumber. The community center was taking shape, inch by inch, brick by careful brick. It would bear the name Naomi Grace Community Center, and not because it sounded poetic, because it was earned, because a woman who once braided Lucille O'Neal's hair had stood up to power, lost everything, and became the soil in which new life would grow. Shaq had funded the build personally, quietly, no billboards, no ribbon-cutting sponsors, just a plaque at the entrance, with a quote from Naomi's letter. "If the fire didn't kill us, don't let the forgetting do it." Across the street, Zion stood before a newly painted wall. A ladder leaned against it, and the boy, now taller, more open, his silence softened but never fully gone, added the final stroke to a mural that had become the soul of the block. In it, a barefoot black woman, in a faded dress, extended a loaf of bread to a towering figure shaped like a giant, not monstrous, but gentle. The figure knelt slightly, hands open. Behind them, a crowd stood watching, faceless but upright, their bodies glowing with golden lines like roots in motion. Zion stepped back and looked at his work. His fingers were stained with paint. His eyes were steady. When Shaq approached, he smiled without words, and nodded once. "Looks like her," Shaq said, swallowing something thick in his throat. Zion didn't speak. He didn't need to. At the corner near the mural, Pastor Hollis Carr stood surrounded by a small group of teens, in folding chairs. He spoke with fire again, not from behind a pulpit, but from a sidewalk with cracks older than half his audience. He preached not scripture, but survival, hope, the power of showing up, of witnessing, of not selling your silence for comfort. His voice rose over the hum of construction and the occasional buzz of traffic. We were not lost, we were stolen, and now we reclaim. One block down, Ruthie Lane sat under a striped canopy, sorting photographs, journals, receipts, and deeds into a collection that would become the neighborhood archive. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and dictated to a volunteer with a steady rhythm. Her voice had grown stronger, clearer. She called herself the keeper of stories now, and no one dared argue. Even the city's historical society had reached out asking for inclusion. Ruthie had laughed and said they'd have to come to her porch like everyone else. Near the rebuilt house, the one that once sagged with sorrow, its windows broken, its walls sinking into the ground, kids now chased each other through a yard full of sunflowers and tomato plants. Solar panels lined the roof, and wind chimes whispered from the porch rail. Shaq stopped at the gate. The house that had once haunted his sleep was no longer a wound. It was a memory given new flesh. Delilah answered the door before he knocked, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. She wore a white linen dress, loose and clean, her hair tied back with a scarf that once belonged to her mother. She smiled. "You didn't save us," she said. "You remembered us." Shaq laughed softly. "Guess it turns out memory's stronger than money." She stepped aside to let him in. The interior had been transformed, not polished like a showroom, but whole, honest. Photographs lined the hallway. Naomi Grace in black and white, Zion holding a sunflower, Ruthie at her porch table, Pastor Carr mid-sermon. In the living room, Mira O'Neal, Shaq's daughter, sat cross-legged beside Zion, reading from a book in a slow, deliberate rhythm. They were part of the new literacy group, which met every week on the porch or under trees. No pressure, no grade, just reading, out loud, with someone who listened. Shaq watched them for a long moment before heading back outside. He sat on the porch, arms resting on his knees, and let the quiet stretch. Not the old quiet, the kind that smothered. This was different. It breathed. It let space exist. A neighbor walked by, with a stroller. Someone across the street played a trumpet badly, but joyfully. Laughter carried on the wind. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the tops of the rebuilt homes and reclaimed yards. Delilah joined him a few minutes later, sipping from a chipped mug. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Shaq leaned back, looking at the horizon, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Not pride, not even peace. It was wholeness, a completeness that came not from victory, but from truth. He whispered into the evening air, not expecting a response. "We rise by lifting others." And somewhere beyond the fence line, Chimes danced in the wind like applause. If this story moved something in you, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who's forgotten what justice looks like up close. Let it start conversations where silence used to sit. Be the kind of witness that turns truth into change, because remembering is powerful, but acting on it is unstoppable.